Millionaire humiliated waitress at Gala, but her secret lawyer husband took his fortune overnight. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Sarah Martinez took a deep breath as she stood before the towering glass doors of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, her reflection staring back at her in the polished surface. At 30 years old, she had worked hundreds of events like this one, but the annual Children's Hospital charity gala always felt different, more intimidating, more exclusive. The black uniform she wore was crisp and professional, pressed to perfection the night before in the tiny laundry room of the apartment she shared with her husband, Michael. The doorman, recognizing her catering company's uniform, nodded respectfully and held the door open. "Evening, miss. Service entrance is around back as usual." "Thank you, James," Sarah replied with a genuine smile. She'd been working events at the Grand Metropolitan for 3 years now, and she always made it a point to learn the staff's names. It was a small gesture, but one that had earned her respect among the hotel's employees. As she made her way through the service corridors toward the ballroom, Sarah's mind wandered to Michael, probably hunched over his law books at their kitchen table at this very moment. Final semester exams were just weeks away, and the stress was showing on his usually cheerful face. They'd been living on her waitressing income for nearly 3 years now, every penny carefully budgeted and saved. The sacrifice would be worth it when he graduated and joined Harrison, Blackwood and Associates. One of the city's most prestigious law firms had already offered him a position. The service doors opened, and Sarah stepped into a world that never failed to take her breath away. The Grand Metropolitan's crystal ballroom lived up to its name. Massive baccarat chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted with cherubs and clouds, casting rainbow prisms across walls lined with gold leaf. Tonight, the room had been transformed into a wonderland of white roses and silver accents, with round tables draped in silk that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. "Sarah, thank God you're here," called Jennifer Walsh, the event coordinator, rushing over with a clipboard clutched to her chest. Jennifer was a thin woman in her 40s who always seemed to be on the verge of a nervous breakdown during major events. "We're already behind schedule, and the Worthington table is asking for champagne service to start immediately." "No problem, Jen. Where do you need me stationed?" Sarah had learned early in her career that staying calm when management panicked was the key to success in the service industry. "Start with the VIP section on the left side of the room. That's where all the major donors are seated tonight." "And Sarah," Jennifer's voice dropped to a whisper, "please be extra careful tonight. We have some very important people here, including Richard Sterling from Sterling Industries. He donated $250,000 this year, and the hospital board is hoping for even more." Sarah nodded, though the name Richard Sterling meant nothing to her. In her world, the wealthy guests were simply faces to serve. She rarely paid attention to their names or backgrounds. It was easier that way, keeping the professional distance that allowed her to do her job without getting caught up in the politics and personalities of high society. She made her way to the service bar, where dozens of champagne flutes were already filled and waiting on silver trays. The bartender, Carlos, had been working events at the Grand Metropolitan even longer than Sarah. "Big night tonight, Sarah," he said, adjusting his bow tie. "Heard they're expecting to raise over $2 million for the Children's Hospital. Some of these people write checks bigger than my annual salary just for the tax write-off. As long as they tip well, I'm happy," Sarah replied, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. She'd grown up in a working-class family where every dollar mattered, and seeing the casual way these people spent money on a single evening's entertainment sometimes made her uncomfortable. Still, she reminded herself, their generosity was funding medical equipment and treatments for sick children. That made the inequality easier to swallow. The ballroom was filling up now, men in tailored tuxedos that probably cost more than Sarah's car, and women draped in designer gowns with jewelry that sparkled under the chandeliers. Sarah recognized a few faces from previous events: the mayor and his wife, several city council members, a federal judge, and various business leaders whose faces appeared regularly in the society pages. She lifted a tray of champagne and began circulating through the VIP section, moving with the practiced grace that came from years of navigating crowded rooms while balancing glassware. Most guests barely acknowledged her presence, which was exactly how she preferred it. She was there to serve, not to socialize, and invisibility made the job easier. The auction was already underway at the front of the room, with a famous local news anchor serving as the charismatic auctioneer. A week in a Tuscany villa had just sold for $15,000, and bidding was fierce for a private dinner with the city's celebrity chef. Sarah watched from the periphery, marveling at how casually these people threw around amounts that represented months of her salary. "Excuse me, miss." An elderly woman in pearls and a midnight blue gown touched Sarah's arm gently. "Could I possibly get a glass of champagne?" "Of course, ma'am," Sarah replied, offering her tray with a smile. The woman selected a glass and pressed a $20 bill into Sarah's hand. "Thank you, dear. You're doing wonderful work tonight." It was moments like these that reminded Sarah why she didn't mind the service industry. Most people, regardless of their wealth, were basically kind when treated with respect and professionalism. She tucked the tip into her pocket, knowing it would go toward Michael's textbooks or their grocery bill. The evening progressed smoothly, with Sarah refilling glasses, clearing empty plates, and ensuring that the VIP guests wanted for nothing. The Children's Hospital's director had given a moving speech about the new pediatric wing that would be built with the evening's donations, complete with a video featuring some of the young patients who would benefit. There wasn't a dry eye in the house, and Sarah felt proud to be part of an event that would make such a difference. As the formal program wound down and guests began to mingle more freely, Sarah continued her rounds, staying alert for raised hands or empty glasses. The evening was nearly over, and she was already thinking about the late-night study session she'd have with Michael when she got home. Tomorrow was Saturday, which meant she could sleep in before her afternoon shift at the downtown restaurant where she worked weekends. She had no way of knowing that her peaceful, routine evening was about to be shattered by a man whose cruelty would change the course of both their lives forever. The atmosphere in the Crystal Ballroom shifted perceptibly when Richard Sterling made his entrance at precisely 8:47 p.m. Conversations paused mid-sentence, heads turned, and even the string quartet seemed to play with more flourish as the evening's most prominent donor arrived fashionably late to his own sponsored event. At 55, Richard Sterling was the embodiment of inherited privilege wrapped in a perfectly tailored Armani tuxedo that cost more than Sarah's annual car payments. His silver hair was styled by the city's most exclusive salon, each strand precisely placed to project an image of distinguished authority. His Italian leather shoes gleamed under the chandeliers, custom made by a cobbler in Florence who crafted footwear exclusively for billionaires and royalty. But it wasn't just his appearance that commanded attention, it was the aura of absolute power that surrounded him like an expensive cologne. Richard Sterling had never known want, never experienced rejection, never faced a door that wouldn't open at the mention of his name. Born into one of the city's oldest families, he had inherited Sterling Industries at 28 when his father died in a sailing accident, and had spent the following 27 years expanding the empire with ruthless efficiency. Sterling Industries was a sprawling conglomerate that touched nearly every aspect of the city's economy: luxury real estate developments, manufacturing plants, import-export businesses, and a private investment firm that managed portfolios for the ultra-wealthy. Richard's personal net worth exceeded $200 million, a figure that continued to grow even as he slept, thanks to investments and holdings that most people couldn't even comprehend. Tonight's gala bore his fingerprints everywhere. The Sterling Industries logo was prominently displayed on every program, banner, and promotional material. His $250,000 donation had secured naming rights to the new pediatric wing, ensuring that future generations of sick children would be treated in the Richard Sterling Children's Wellness Center. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew him personally. Richard had never particularly liked children and had chosen to remain childless, viewing parenthood as an unnecessary complication to his lifestyle. He moved through the ballroom like a shark through water, accepting handshakes and air kisses from socialites eager to remain in his good graces. Mayor Patricia Hoffman rushed to greet him personally, her campaign having received a substantial contribution from Sterling just months earlier. Judge William Crawford abandoned his dinner to pay respects to the man whose legal troubles had mysteriously disappeared over the years through carefully applied pressure and strategically placed donations. "Richard, wonderful to see you," gushed Mrs. Eleanor Worthington, the hospital board chairwoman, practically genuflecting as she approached. "We cannot thank you enough for your generosity. The children will benefit from your kindness for generations to come." "It's nothing," Richard replied with false modesty, though his chest swelled with pride. "I believe in giving back to the community that has given me so much." The words rolled off his tongue effortlessly, a practiced speech he'd given at dozens of similar events. In truth, his charitable donations were carefully calculated for maximum tax benefit and social leverage, rather than any genuine desire to help others. He surveyed the ballroom with the satisfied expression of a man who owned everything he saw. The venue, the guests, the very air they breathed, all of it bent to his will through the careful application of wealth and influence. Richard had learned early in life that money wasn't just a means of purchasing goods and services. It was a tool for controlling people, situations, and outcomes. Everyone had a price, and Richard Sterling had never met a problem that couldn't be solved with the right amount of cash applied in the right way. His personal assistant, Marcus Chen, materialized at his elbow with a tablet displaying the evening's schedule and a detailed dossier on every major donor present. Marcus was a Harvard MBA who earned more than most doctors simply to manage Richard's calendar and ensure his every whim was anticipated and fulfilled. "The mayor wants a photo opportunity after the auction concludes," Marcus murmured discreetly, "and the hospital director hopes to discuss the possibility of endowing a research chair in your name. Also, your table is ready whenever you'd like to be seated." Richard nodded absently, his attention already wandering. These events were simultaneously the highlight and the burden of his social calendar, necessary for maintaining his reputation as a philanthropist and community leader, but ultimately tedious affairs filled with people whose company he tolerated rather than enjoyed. He had trained himself to project charm and magnanimity at such functions, understanding that his public image required careful cultivation. The press coverage would describe him as generous, community-minded, and a pillar of local society. His PR firm would ensure that photos from the evening appeared in all the right publications, cementing his status as one of the city's most eligible bachelors and respected business leaders. But beneath the polished exterior lurked a man who viewed other people as chess pieces to be moved around for his benefit. Employees were expendable resources, business partners were temporary allies, and the general public existed primarily to generate the wealth that funded his lifestyle. Richard had never learned empathy because he'd never needed it. Money had always been sufficient to get what he wanted from people. His eyes swept the room, cataloging faces and calculating social hierarchies with the precision of a computer. He mentally sorted people into categories: useful, potentially useful, and irrelevant. The irrelevant category included virtually all service staff, whom he viewed as interchangeable components of the evening's machinery, no more worthy of individual consideration than the silverware or linens. It was with this mindset that Richard Sterling approached his table in the VIP section, ready to hold court among his social peers while being waited upon by people he considered beneath his notice. He had no idea that his treatment of one particular server would set in motion events that would ultimately cost him everything he held dear. Champagne he commanded imperiously as he settled into his seat, not bothering to look at the approaching server. His tone conveyed exactly what he thought of the hired help. They were there to serve him efficiently and invisibly, nothing more. Sarah Martinez had served thousands of demanding customers throughout her 7 years in the hospitality industry, but something about Richard Sterling's tone immediately set her on edge. It wasn't just the imperious champagne he'd barked without so much as a glance in her direction. It was the complete dismissal in his voice, as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture that happened to be capable of fetching drinks. Taking a steadying breath, Sarah reminded herself of the advice her mother had given her when she first started waitressing. "Kill them with kindness, Mija. The ruder they are, the sweeter you be. It either changes their heart or makes them look foolish. Either way, you win." She approached Sterling's table with a crystal champagne flute filled with Dom Perignon, the same vintage that cost more per bottle than she made in a week. Her professional smile was firmly in place, the one she'd perfected through years of dealing with difficult personalities. "Here's your champagne, sir. Is there anything else I can get for you this evening?" Richard barely acknowledged her presence, snatching the glass without a word of thanks or even eye contact. He immediately turned back to his conversation with Judge Crawford about tax legislation, leaving Sarah standing there like an unwelcome interruption. She was about to retreat gracefully when disaster struck in the most unexpected way. Dr. Amanda Richardson, the hospital's head of pediatric surgery, was animatedly describing a new surgical technique to a group of potential donors at the neighboring table. In her enthusiasm, she gestured broadly with her wine glass, not realizing that Sarah was standing directly behind her chair. The doctor's elbow connected solidly with Sarah's forearm just as she was stepping backward, causing the champagne flute in her hand to tilt dramatically. Time seemed to slow as Sarah watched in horror. A small splash of the golden liquid arced through the air, landing on Richard Sterling's pristine white shirt cuff and custom platinum cufflinks. It was perhaps a teaspoon of champagne, barely enough to dampen the fabric, but the effect on Sterling was immediate and volcanic. The conversation at his table stopped abruptly as every head turned toward the commotion. Richard Sterling stared at his slightly dampened cuff as if Sarah had doused him with acid. His face transformed from its practiced social mask into something truly ugly, a mixture of rage, disgust, and pure contempt that made Sarah's stomach clench with fear. "Are you completely incompetent?" Sterling's voice cut through the ambient chatter like a knife, loud enough to be heard at tables 20 feet away. Other conversations began to pause as people turned to see what was happening in the VIP section. "This shirt costs more than you make in a month. Do you have any idea who I am?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as dozens of eyes focused on her. The beautiful ballroom suddenly felt like a courtroom where she was on trial, with Sterling as both prosecutor and judge. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her empty tray, but she managed to keep her voice steady and professional. "I'm terribly sorry, sir. It was completely accidental. Someone bumped into me. Please let me get something to help clean that for you, and I'll make sure to cover any cleaning costs personally." Her offer of personal responsibility only seemed to infuriate Sterling further. He jerked his arm away as she reached for her service towel, his movement so violent that his chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. The sound seemed to echo in the increasingly quiet ballroom as more guests became aware of the altercation. "Don't you dare touch me," Sterling snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "You've done quite enough damage for one evening. This is exactly the kind of careless incompetence I've come to expect from people like you." The phrase "people like you" hung in the air with unmistakable implications. Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest as she realized this wasn't just about a stained shirt. This was about something much deeper and more troubling. Sterling's eyes held a gleam that suggested he was actually enjoying her humiliation, feeding off her discomfort like a predator savoring its prey. Judge Crawford cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that Sterling's reaction was disproportionate to the minor accident. "Richard, perhaps we could." "No," Sterling cut him off sharply. "I'm tired of making excuses for poor service and careless behavior. This woman needs to learn that there are consequences for her actions." Dr. Richardson, who had witnessed the entire incident, started to rise from her chair. "Excuse me, but I think I may have accidentally." Sterling's withering glare silenced her mid-sentence. The message was clear. He had chosen his target, and no one was going to deprive him of this moment. Sarah realized with growing horror that Richard Sterling was about to make her the evening's entertainment, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The ballroom had grown noticeably quieter, with conversations becoming subdued whispers as people strained to hear what was happening at the Sterling table. Sarah could feel hundreds of eyes on her, some sympathetic, others merely curious about the drama unfolding before them. She wanted nothing more than to disappear, to melt into the floor and escape this nightmare. But she was trapped, caught between her professional obligation to provide service and her personal need to maintain some shred of dignity. In that moment, standing before one of the city's most powerful men as he prepared to humiliate her publicly, Sarah had no idea that her husband was at home preparing for a career that would one day allow him to hold Sterling accountable for his cruelty. All she knew was that the beautiful evening she had been so proud to be part of was about to become the worst night of her professional life, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to prevent it. What happened next would be seared into Sarah's memory forever, a moment of cruelty so calculated and vicious that it would haunt her dreams for months to come. Richard Sterling, sensing that he had a captive audience, and perhaps emboldened by the expensive whiskey he'd consumed before arriving, decided to transform a minor accident into a public execution of Sarah's character and dignity. He rose from his chair slowly, deliberately, his imposing 6-foot frame allowing him to tower over Sarah's petite figure. The movement was theatrical, designed to draw even more attention to the unfolding drama. Conversations throughout the ballroom had now completely ceased, with over 300 of the city's elite turning to witness the spectacle that Sterling was orchestrating. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling announced in a voice that carried easily across the vast ballroom, as if he were addressing a board meeting rather than humiliating a working woman. "I believe we are witnessing a perfect example of what has gone wrong with the service industry in this country." Sarah felt her face burn with shame as every eye in the room fixed upon her. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear entirely, but her legs felt rooted to the marble floor. Her hands trembled as she clasped them behind her back, trying desperately to maintain some semblance of composure as Sterling prepared to systematically destroy her dignity. "This woman," Sterling continued, gesturing dismissively at Sarah as if she were an exhibit in a museum, "has just demonstrated the kind of careless, unprofessional behavior that typifies her entire generation. No pride in their work, no respect for their betters, no understanding of the consequences of their incompetence." Judge Crawford shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly recognizing that Sterling's reaction had crossed the line from reasonable complaint into something far more sinister. Several other guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, but none had the courage to speak up against one of the city's most powerful men. "Look at her," Sterling said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Probably never finished high school, working dead-end jobs because she lacks the intelligence or ambition to do anything meaningful with her life. People like this should be grateful that we even provide them with employment opportunities, yet this is how they repay our generosity with carelessness and incompetence." Sarah felt tears threatening to spill down her cheeks, but she refused to give Sterling the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She thought of Michael, probably still studying at their kitchen table, working toward his law degree through sheer determination and her financial support. She thought of her volunteer work at the literacy center, where she helped adults learn to read. She thought of the college degree hanging on their bedroom wall, the one she'd earned while working full-time to pay for her education. Sterling knew nothing about her, yet he was painting her as lazy, stupid, and worthless in front of hundreds of people. The injustice of it was breathtaking, but she was powerless to defend herself without risking her job and, by extension, Michael's future. "I work 3 jobs to support my family," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible but steady with quiet dignity. "This was an accident, and I've apologized sincerely. I don't deserve to be spoken to this way." Her words only seemed to fuel Sterling's fury. The fact that she had dared to speak back, to assert her basic human dignity, appeared to enrage him beyond all reason. His face darkened as he prepared to deliver the coup de grace. "Don't you dare speak to me about what you deserve," Sterling snarled. "You have no idea what you're talking about. I donate more to charity in a single evening than you'll earn in your entire pathetic lifetime. I create jobs for thousands of people, while you can't even handle the simple task of serving drinks without causing property damage." Jennifer Walsh, the event coordinator, appeared at Sarah's elbow like a guardian angel, her face pale with horror at how badly the situation had deteriorated. "Mr. Sterling, please let me handle this. Sarah is one of our most professional servers, and I'm sure we can resolve this matter quietly." "No," Sterling declared imperiously. "I want her removed from my site immediately, and I expect my dry cleaning bill to be covered, along with a formal written apology from your management. People like this need to learn their place in the world, and apparently the only way they learn is through public consequences." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Jennifer quickly escorted Sarah toward the service entrance, whispering urgent apologies and assurances that this wouldn't affect her employment. But the damage was done. Sarah could feel the weight of hundreds of stares as she was marched from the ballroom like a criminal, her professional reputation destroyed by one man's inexplicable cruelty. As the service doors closed behind her, Sarah could hear Sterling's voice resuming its normal conversational tone, as if nothing significant had happened. He was already accepting sympathy and support from his table mates, who murmured agreement about the declining standards of service staff and the difficulty of finding competent help. In the service corridor, Sarah finally allowed herself to cry, not just from the humiliation, but from the sheer injustice of it all. She had done nothing wrong except exist in Sterling's presence at an unfortunate moment, yet she had been treated like garbage in front of the city's most influential people. The worst part was knowing that tomorrow's Society page coverage would likely include some mention of the incident, ensuring that her humiliation would be preserved in print for posterity. Jennifer handed her a tissue and squeezed her shoulder gently. "Sarah, I am so sorry. That man's behavior was completely unacceptable. You've done nothing wrong, and your job is absolutely secure." "Mr. Sterling, well, money talks, but that doesn't give him the right to treat people the way he just treated you." Sarah nodded gratefully, but she knew the truth. Men like Richard Sterling didn't face consequences for their behavior because their wealth insulated them from accountability. He would go home to his mansion that night feeling satisfied with his performance, never giving another thought to the woman whose dignity he had trampled for sport. She had no way of knowing that the man she'd married was about to embark on a career path that would eventually allow him to hold people like Sterling accountable for their actions. All she knew was that she needed to get home to Michael's arms and try to forget the worst night of her working life. The taxi ride home felt endless as Sarah stared out the window at the city lights blurring past, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. She'd changed out of her uniform in the hotel's staff locker room, but she could still feel the weight of hundreds of judgmental stares, could still hear Richard Sterling's venomous words echoing in her mind. Her hands shook slightly as she counted out the fare, including a generous tip for the driver who'd kindly offered her tissues when he'd noticed her tears. Their apartment building stood in stark contrast to the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, a modest 3-story structure built in the 1970s, with brown brick and small windows that spoke of practical concerns rather than architectural elegance. But as Sarah climbed the familiar stairs to their second-floor unit, she felt her first sense of peace since the evening's nightmare began. Home meant safety, understanding, and most importantly, Michael. She could see the warm glow of their kitchen light through the peephole before she even inserted her key. Michael was exactly where she'd expected to find him, hunched over their small dining table, which had been converted into a makeshift law library. Legal textbooks, highlighted case studies, and handwritten notes covered every inch of available surface. His laptop displayed a half-finished outline for his constitutional law final, and an empty coffee mug sat at his elbow alongside the remains of a sandwich he'd clearly forgotten to finish. At 28, Michael Martinez possessed the kind of quiet intensity that had first attracted Sarah when they'd met at a coffee shop near the community college where she'd been taking night classes. His dark hair was perpetually disheveled from running his fingers through it while studying, and his brown eyes held a depth of compassion that had only grown stronger during their 3 years of marriage. He looked up as she entered, his expression immediately shifting from concentrated study to concerned alarm as he took in her puffy eyes and defeated posture. Without a word, he pushed back his chair and crossed to her, gathering her into his arms with the kind of protective tenderness that had been her anchor through countless difficulties. "Sarah, my Amber, what happened? You look like you've been crying." His voice carried the slight accent he'd inherited from his Puerto Rican grandmother, which became more pronounced when he was worried or emotional. Sarah let herself sink into his embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with coffee and the old books that had become the soundtrack of their lives. For a moment, she just held on to him, drawing strength from his solid presence and unconditional love. "It was horrible, Michael. Just horrible." The words came out in a rush as 3 hours of suppressed emotion finally found release. She told him everything: Sterling's imperious demand for champagne, the accidental spill, and most painfully, the public humiliation that followed. Michael listened without interruption, his jaw tightening with each detail, his arms holding her closer as she described Sterling's cruel characterization of her intelligence and worth. "He made me feel so small," Sarah whispered against Michael's chest. "In front of all those people, he made me sound like I was nothing, just some stupid girl who couldn't do anything right. And I couldn't defend myself because I needed the job, because we need the money for your school." Michael's response surprised her with its controlled fury. She'd seen him angry before, but never like this, never with the cold, calculating rage that transformed his usually gentle features into something harder and more dangerous. "That bastard had no right to treat you that way," Michael said, his voice low but vibrating with barely contained emotion. "No one has that right, regardless of how much money they have or how important they think they are. You are brilliant, Sarah. You're working 3 jobs to put me through law school while volunteering at the literacy center and maintaining a 3.8 GPA in your own night classes. You've got more character in your little finger than that Sterling asshole has in his entire body." Sarah pulled back to look at her husband's face, seeing something she'd never witnessed before, a kind of protective fury that spoke to depths of love she'd never fully understood. Michael had always been her gentle scholar, the man who brought her flowers and left sweet notes in her lunch bag. But tonight she was seeing another side of him, the side that would soon make him a formidable lawyer. "Maybe he was right, though," Sarah said quietly, voicing the fear that had been growing in her heart. "Maybe I am just..." "Stop." Michael's voice cut through her self-doubt with surgical precision. "Don't you dare let that man's poison into your head. You know who you are, Sarah. You're the woman who taught herself accounting to help manage our finances. You're the person who stayed up all night helping Mrs. Chen next door fill out her citizenship paperwork. You're the one who volunteers every Sunday to teach adults how to read, even though it's your only day off." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away tears she hadn't realized were still falling. "You want to know what you are? You're the strongest person I know. You're putting your own dreams on hold to support mine, and you never complain, not once. That man doesn't know you, and his opinion means absolutely nothing." As Michael held her, Sarah felt some of the evening's poison begin to drain away, replaced by the warmth of unconditional love and respect. She had no way of knowing that her husband was already formulating plans that would ensure Richard Sterling's cruelty would not go unanswered, plans that would take years to unfold, but would ultimately deliver justice beyond anything she could imagine. For now, she was simply grateful to be home, safe in the arms of the man who saw her true worth when the rest of the world refused to look past her uniform. While Sarah tried to put the humiliating incident behind her by throwing herself into her work routine, Michael found himself unable to shake the image of his wife's tear-stained face or forget the cruel words that had been spoken to her. 3 days after the gala, instead of reviewing his notes for the upcoming constitutional law exam, he sat at his laptop researching Richard Sterling with the methodical thoroughness that his professors had praised throughout law school. What he discovered was a complex portrait of American capitalism at its most unchecked. Sterling Industries was indeed a massive enterprise, with tentacles reaching into virtually every sector of the local economy. The company's public face was impressive gleaming office towers, charitable foundations, and a PR department that ensured Sterling's name appeared regularly in the business press as a visionary leader and pillar of the community. But Michael's legal training had taught him to look beyond the glossy corporate website and press releases. Public records told a different story, one that painted Richard Sterling not as a benevolent business leader, but as a ruthless operator who viewed laws and regulations as obstacles to be circumvented rather than guidelines to be followed. The Department of Labor's database showed a disturbing pattern of violations at Sterling's manufacturing facilities. Over the past 5 years, there had been 17 citations for unsafe working conditions, including inadequate ventilation systems that exposed workers to toxic chemicals and machinery that lacked proper safety guards. Each violation had resulted in the minimum fine allowable by law, amounts that Sterling paid without contest the cost of doing business rather than genuine reform. More troubling were the wage theft complaints that had been filed with the State Labor Board. Michael found documentation of at least 24 cases where Sterling Industries had been accused of forcing employees to work off the clock, denying overtime pay, and misclassifying full-time workers as independent contractors to avoid paying benefits. Most of these complaints had been settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements that prevented the affected workers from discussing their experiences publicly. The sexual harassment lawsuits were perhaps the most disturbing. Michael discovered 3 separate cases in the past 7 years where female employees had accused Sterling personally of inappropriate behavior. One case involved a young accountant who claimed Sterling had conditioned her promotion on sexual favors. Another involved a cleaning woman who reported that Sterling had cornered her in his office after hours. All 3 cases had been settled quietly, with the women receiving undisclosed financial settlements in exchange for their silence. But it was the financial irregularities that caught Michael's attention most sharply. His summer internship at Brennan and Associates, a firm specializing in white-collar criminal defense, had given him insight into the subtle signs of corporate malfeasance. As he pored over Sterling Industries' public financial filings, he began to notice discrepancies that suggested something far more serious than poor workplace practices. The company's tax returns, available through public records requests, showed charitable donations that seemed inconsistent with the actual amounts received by the listed beneficiaries. A call to the Children's Hospital's Development Office, conducted under the guise of academic research, revealed that Sterling's claimed $250,000 donation was actually only $150,000, a significant discrepancy that suggested inflated charitable deductions for tax purposes. More suspicious were the payments to consulting firms and overseas suppliers. Michael's trained eye recognized the hallmarks of a shell company scheme multiple payments to entities with generic names, addresses that traced back to vacant lots, and a pattern of transactions designed to obscure the ultimate destination of company funds. Late one evening, as Sarah worked her shift at the downtown restaurant, Michael made a breakthrough. Cross-referencing Sterling Industries' supplier payments with corporate registration databases, he discovered that several of the company's largest vendors were actually shell companies controlled by Sterling himself. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. Sterling Industries would pay inflated invoices to these fake companies for non-existent services, allowing Sterling to siphon money from the business while claiming the payments as tax-deductible expenses. The potential scope of the fraud was staggering. Based on his preliminary calculations, Michael estimated that Sterling had been systematically stealing from his own company and cheating on his taxes to the tune of millions of dollars annually. If his suspicions were correct, Richard Sterling wasn't just a cruel bully, he was a criminal who had been operating with impunity for years. Michael closed his laptop and sat back in his chair, his mind racing with possibilities. He thought about Sarah's humiliation at the gala, about the workers who had been cheated out of wages and benefits, about the women who had been sexually harassed and then silenced with money. A plan was beginning to form in his mind, one that would require patience, careful preparation, and the kind of meticulous attention to detail that had made him one of the top students in his law school class. Richard Sterling had built his empire on the assumption that his wealth made him untouchable, that his victims were too weak or too poor to fight back effectively. But he had made one critical miscalculation. He had humiliated the wife of someone who would soon have both the skills and the connections to hold him accountable for his crimes. Michael opened his laptop again and began typing notes for a conversation he planned to have with his future colleagues at Harrison, Blackwood, and Associates. If his suspicions were correct, Richard Sterling was about to discover that some battles couldn't be won with money alone. The morning of the bar examination dawned gray and drizzling, matching Michael's nervous energy as he stood outside the convention center with hundreds of other aspiring lawyers. He'd spent the previous 6 months preparing for this moment, while simultaneously conducting his covert investigation into Richard Sterling's business practices. The dual focus had pushed him to his limits, but as he walked into the testing facility, Michael felt a calm confidence settle over him. The 3-day examination was a marathon of legal knowledge, analytical reasoning, and essay writing that would determine whether his years of study would translate into a license to practice law. Michael approached each section methodically, drawing on his extensive preparation and the practical experience he'd gained during his internships. His specialization in corporate law and white-collar crime served him particularly well during the business law and ethics portions of the exam. While Michael sat for his bar exam, Sarah maintained their household routine with the same quiet strength that had sustained them through 3 years of law school. She worked her regular shifts at the restaurant and catering company, carefully managing their finances to ensure they could survive the weeks or months that might pass before Michael found employment as a licensed attorney. The waiting period for bar results was agonizing. Michael tried to distract himself by job hunting and continuing his research into Sterling Industries, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Everything they had worked for, their financial sacrifices, Sarah's long hours, his years of study hinged on a pass/fail determination that wouldn't be announced for 10 weeks. When the results were finally posted online, Michael was alone in their apartment, Sarah having left early for a morning catering shift. His hands trembled as he entered his identification number and waited for the page to load. The single word pass that appeared on his screen triggered a flood of emotions: relief, pride, gratitude, and determination. His first call was to Sarah, who screamed with joy so loudly that her co-workers at the restaurant could hear her celebration across the kitchen. His second call was to Elizabeth Harrison at Harrison, Blackwood and Associates, who congratulated him warmly and confirmed his start date for the following Monday. Harrison, Blackwood and Associates occupied the 32nd floor of the downtown financial district's most prestigious tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city where Michael had grown up. The firm's reputation was built on representing clients who faced complex corporate litigation, regulatory investigations, and white-collar criminal charges. Elizabeth Harrison, the firm's founding partner, was a legend in legal circles, a former federal prosecutor who had transitioned to private practice after successfully prosecuting several high-profile corporate corruption cases. At 55, she possessed the kind of sharp intelligence and moral authority that had made her one of the city's most respected attorneys. "Michael, welcome to the firm," she said during his first day orientation, her handshake firm and her smile genuine. "I've been following your academic work, particularly your law review article on corporate tax evasion schemes. Impressive analysis for someone who hasn't even taken the bar yet. Well, hadn't at the time." The firm's culture was exactly what Michael had hoped for: intellectually rigorous, ethically grounded, and committed to holding powerful individuals and corporations accountable for their actions. His colleagues were brilliant lawyers who had chosen to work at Harrison Blackwood not for the highest possible salary, but for the opportunity to practice law at the intersection of justice and social responsibility. Michael's first assignments were typical for a new associate: research memos, document reviews, and supporting more senior attorneys on complex cases. But Elizabeth Harrison had recognized his potential and made sure he was exposed to the firm's most challenging work. Within his first month, he was assisting on a case involving a pharmaceutical company that had hidden dangerous side effects from regulators. It was during his second month at the firm that Michael made his move. He requested a private meeting with Elizabeth Harrison, ostensibly to discuss his career development, but actually to share his findings about Richard Sterling's business practices. "Elizabeth, I've been conducting some preliminary research into potential corporate fraud, and I think I've uncovered something significant," Michael began, spreading his meticulously organized files across her conference table. "Sterling Industries appears to be engaged in systematic tax evasion, wage theft, and possibly money laundering." Harrison examined Michael's research with the experienced eye of someone who had built her career on following financial paper trails. The evidence was compelling: bank records, tax filings, corporate registrations, and witness statements that painted a clear picture of criminal activity. "This is excellent work, Michael. Very thorough, very professional. But I have to ask, what's your personal interest in Richard Sterling? This level of investigation goes beyond casual curiosity." Michael had prepared for this question, and he answered with complete honesty. He told Harrison about Sarah's humiliation at the charity gala, about Sterling's cruel and public abuse of a working woman who had done nothing wrong. He explained how Sterling's behavior had motivated him to look deeper into the man's character and business practices. "I want to be completely transparent about my motivations," Michael concluded. "This started as personal anger over how Sterling treated my wife, but it's become something much larger. If I'm right about the scope of his criminal activity, he's been stealing from workers, cheating taxpayers, and using his wealth to silence his victims for years. Elizabeth Harrison studied Michael carefully, weighing his motivations against the quality of his research and the potential significance of the case. Finally, she nodded with the kind of decisive authority that had made her one of the city's most successful attorneys. Michael, I think you may have just handed us the most important case of the year. And I think Richard Sterling is about to discover that money can't buy immunity from the law. Incident agreed without question. Michael settled into his new role, handling a variety of cases while building his reputation. He specialized in corporate law and white-collar crime, finding satisfaction in protecting workers and small businesses from exploitation by larger corporations. It was during his third month at the firm that opportunity knocked. Elizabeth Harrison called him into her office with an interesting proposition. Michael, we've been contacted by the IRS. They're investigating several major corporations for tax fraud, and they need attorneys with fresh eyes and sharp minds, interested in taking on some very wealthy, very powerful defendants. Michael's thoughts immediately went to Richard Sterling. Absolutely, he replied. When do we start? The federal investigation into Sterling Industries began with the kind of methodical precision that characterized the most successful white-collar crime prosecutions. Michael found himself at the center of a massive operation that involved not just Harrison, Blackwood, and Associates, but also the Internal Revenue Service, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Department of Justice's Corporate Fraud Task Force. Elizabeth Harrison had wasted no time in contacting her former colleagues at the U.S. Attorney's Office, where she had built her reputation prosecuting complex financial crimes. Within a week of Michael's presentation, federal agents were quietly opening preliminary inquiries into Sterling Industries' business practices, tax filings, and corporate structure. Michael was assigned to a specialized task force that included some of the country's most experienced forensic accountants and financial investigators. The team worked out of a secure conference room in the federal building, surrounded by whiteboards covered in organizational charts, financial flow diagrams, and evidence timelines that resembled something from a crime thriller movie. The scope of Sterling's criminal enterprise was breathtaking in its complexity and audacity. Over the course of 15 years, Richard Sterling had constructed an elaborate web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and fraudulent transactions designed to siphon millions of dollars from Sterling Industries while simultaneously evading federal income taxes. The scheme operated on multiple levels of deception. Sterling had created over 30 fake consulting firms, each with fictitious employees and manufactured invoices for services that were never performed. These shell companies would bill Sterling Industries for millions of dollars in advisory services, market research, and strategic planning. The money would then be funneled through a series of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, before ultimately landing in Sterling's personal investment portfolio. Meanwhile, Sterling was claiming these fraudulent payments as legitimate business expenses on his corporate tax returns, reducing Sterling Industries' reported profits and therefore its tax liability. The individual tax evasion was equally brazen. Sterling had hidden nearly $40 million in unreported income over the past decade, money that should have generated approximately $12 million in federal tax revenue. The investigation required absolute secrecy. Sterling's wealth and connections meant that any leaked information could result in evidence being destroyed, assets being moved offshore, or witnesses being intimidated into silence. Michael found himself living a double life, spending his days analyzing financial records and building criminal cases while maintaining the facade of a normal junior associate at his law firm. The forensic accounting work was painstaking and exhausting. Michael would spend 12-hour days poring over bank statements, wire transfer records, and corporate filings, looking for the subtle inconsistencies and patterns that revealed Sterling's criminal activity. Each fraudulent transaction had to be documented, verified, and connected to the larger conspiracy in a way that would hold up under the intense scrutiny of a federal criminal trial. The breakthrough came when Michael discovered Sterling's fatal mistake, a series of wire transfers from 2018 that directly connected Sterling's personal accounts to the shell company scheme. In his arrogance, Sterling had occasionally moved money directly from his fake consulting firms to his personal investment accounts, creating an indisputable paper trail that linked him personally to the fraudulent transactions. "This is it," Michael told Elizabeth Harrison during one of their weekly strategy sessions. "We can prove that Sterling personally controlled these shell companies and that he knew the consulting services were fictitious. The wire transfer records show him moving money directly from the fake companies to his personal accounts. The evidence was overwhelming, but building a bulletproof case required months of additional work. The investigation team had to interview dozens of current and former Sterling Industries employees, many of whom were initially reluctant to cooperate due to fear of retaliation. Slowly, however, a picture emerged of a corporate culture where Sterling's criminal behavior was enabled by a combination of intimidation, generous compensation for key executives, and carefully crafted non-disclosure agreements that kept potential whistleblowers silent. The most disturbing testimony came from Sterling's former chief financial officer, Patricia Coleman, who had been forced to resign after refusing to participate in the fraudulent accounting schemes. Coleman provided detailed information about Sterling's methods, including his practice of backdating contracts, creating fictitious board resolutions, and using company funds for personal expenses that were then disguised as business costs. Mr. Sterling made it very clear that my job security depended on my willingness to look the other way, Coleman testified during a sworn deposition. When I finally refused to sign off on obviously fraudulent invoices, he told me that I could either resign quietly with a generous severance package or be fired for cause and face potential criminal charges myself. As the investigation progressed, Michael found himself thinking often about Sarah's humiliation at the charity gala. The woman who had been publicly degraded as lazy and incompetent was actually working multiple jobs to support her husband's pursuit of justice. The irony was profound. Sterling's cruelty towards Sarah had set in motion the very investigation that would ultimately destroy him. Michael never told Sarah about his role in the Sterling investigation, simply saying that he was working on a complex corporate fraud case that required long hours and absolute confidentiality. Sarah supported him as she always had, bringing him dinner at the office during his late nights and never questioning the mysterious nature of his work. The investigation culminated after 8 months of intensive work, with federal agents preparing simultaneous raids on Sterling's business offices, personal residences, and financial institutions. The evidence was overwhelming: over 3,000 documents, dozens of witness statements, and financial records showing a clear pattern of criminal activity spanning more than a decade. Michael stood in the federal building situation room on the morning of the raids, watching multiple screens as FBI agents executed search warrants at locations across the city. After months of painstaking investigation, Richard Sterling was about to face the consequences of a lifetime spent believing that his wealth made him untouchable. The coordinated federal raid on Richard Sterling's empire began at precisely 6:00 a.m. on a crisp Thursday morning in October. Michael watched from the FBI's mobile command center as simultaneous operations unfolded across the city. Teams of federal agents descending on Sterling Industries headquarters, Sterling's Beacon Hill mansion, his weekend estate in the Hamptons, and the offices of his personal financial advisors. The operation had been planned with military precision. Over 100 federal agents participated in the raids, armed with search warrants that authorized them to seize computers, financial records, communication devices, and any other evidence related to Sterling's alleged crimes. The warrants were so comprehensive that they essentially froze Sterling's entire business and personal financial empire. At Sterling Industries' gleaming downtown headquarters, agents in FBI windbreakers streamed through the marble lobby as startled employees watched in shock. Executive assistants were escorted from their desks as agents secured computer systems and began the methodical process of collecting evidence. The company's IT department was placed under federal supervision to prevent any attempt to delete or destroy electronic records. Meanwhile, at Sterling's Beacon Hill mansion, a palatial 19th-century townhouse worth over $8 million, agents executed a search warrant that covered every room, safe, and storage area on the property. Sterling's household staff watched in stunned silence as FBI forensic accountants cataloged art collections, luxury vehicles, and personal belongings that had been purchased with what prosecutors alleged were the proceeds of criminal activity. But the most dramatic moment came at the Brookline Country Club, where Richard Sterling was enjoying his regular Thursday morning golf game with Judge Crawford and 2 prominent local businessmen. Sterling was lining up a putt on the 7th green when FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres approached him, her badge prominently displayed and her voice carrying clearly across the manicured fairway. "Richard Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering," Agent Torres announced as she placed handcuffs on Sterling's wrists. The golf club fell from his hands, landing with a metallic clatter on the green as television news crews, who had been tipped off about the arrest, captured every moment from the club's perimeter. Sterling's face went through a rapid succession of emotions: shock, disbelief, indignation, and finally a kind of panicked recognition that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "This is a mistake," he sputtered as Agent Torres read him his Miranda rights. "I'm Richard Sterling. I donate millions to charity. I employ thousands of people. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Sir, you have the right to remain silent." Agent Torres continued professionally, ignoring Sterling's protests. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The perp walk from the golf course to the waiting federal vehicle was broadcast live on every local news channel and quickly went viral on social media. The image of Richard Sterling still wearing his golf attire, his silver hair disheveled, his face a mask of humiliation and rage being led away in handcuffs, became an iconic symbol of justice delayed but not denied. Michael watched the arrest from his office at Harrison, Blackwood and Associates, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction, vindication, and professional pride. The case he had helped build was airtight. Over 8 months of meticulous investigation had produced evidence so overwhelming that Sterling's conviction seemed virtually assured. The charges filed against Sterling were comprehensive and devastating. The federal grand jury had returned a 47-count indictment that included tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and racketeering charges that could result in a sentence of up to 30 years in federal prison. Additionally, the government was seeking forfeiture of Sterling's entire personal fortune, estimated at over $200 million as proceeds of criminal activity. The media coverage was relentless and universally negative. Sterling's carefully cultivated image as a philanthropist and community leader crumbled as reporters dug deeper into his business practices and personal history. The sexual harassment settlements, the labor violations, the intimidation of whistleblowers, all of the ugly details that Sterling had managed to keep hidden began spilling into the public record. Local television news led their broadcasts with breaking updates about the Sterling investigation. The city's major newspaper assigned a team of investigative reporters to examine Sterling's business empire, uncovering additional evidence of corporate misconduct and personal corruption. Social media lit up with commentary from former Sterling Industries employees who had been afraid to speak publicly until Sterling's arrest gave them protection from retaliation. That evening, Michael finally told Sarah the truth about his involvement in bringing down Richard Sterling. They sat together in their modest apartment, watching news coverage of Sterling's arrest, while Michael explained how her humiliation at the charity gala had motivated him to investigate the man who had treated her so cruelly. "You mean all of this happened because of what he did to me?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with disbelief as she watched footage of Sterling being led away in handcuffs. "No, my Amor," Michael replied, taking her hands in his. "This happened because Richard Sterling is a criminal who has been stealing from workers, cheating taxpayers, and abusing his power for years. What he did to you at the gala just helped me understand what kind of person he really was underneath all that money and fake respectability." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what her husband had accomplished. The man who had made her feel worthless and small was now facing decades in federal prison. His fortune seized, his reputation destroyed, his life's work revealed as a criminal enterprise. "I can't believe it," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks, not tears of sadness this time, but tears of vindication and justice finally served. "He's really going to pay for everything he's done." Michael nodded, pulling his wife close as they watched the news coverage together. Richard Sterling had built his life on the assumption that wealth could buy immunity from consequences, that people like Sarah were too powerless to fight back effectively. But he had made one fatal miscalculation. He had underestimated the power of love, determination, and the American legal system when they worked together in pursuit of justice. The trial of Richard Sterling became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in the city's history. Federal District Judge Maria Santos presided over 6 weeks of testimony that laid bare the scope of Sterling's criminal enterprise and the devastating impact of his actions on workers, taxpayers, and the community he had claimed to serve. Michael attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery behind the prosecution table as witness after witness testified about Sterling's crimes. The government's case was overwhelming. Forensic accountants explained the complex shell company schemes. Former employees described Sterling's pattern of intimidation and retaliation, and FBI agents presented evidence of fraudulent transactions totaling nearly $50 million in evaded taxes. Perhaps most compelling was the testimony of Patricia Coleman, Sterling's former chief financial officer, who provided detailed accounts of how Sterling had personally directed the fraudulent accounting schemes that had enabled his tax evasion. Coleman's testimony was devastating in its specificity. She could recall exact dates, specific conversations, and the precise methods Sterling had used to hide his criminal activity. Sterling's defense team, led by one of the country's most expensive white-collar criminal attorneys, attempted to portray their client as a successful businessman who had relied on professional advisors for his tax planning. They argued that any irregularities in Sterling Industries' accounting were the result of miscommunication and overly aggressive interpretations of tax law rather than criminal intent. But the evidence against Sterling was simply too overwhelming. The prosecution presented recordings of phone conversations in which Sterling explicitly discussed hiding income from tax authorities, email communications in which he instructed subordinates to create false documentation, and bank records that showed him personally moving money through the shell company network he had created. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 47 counts in the indictment. Sterling showed no emotion as the foreman read each verdict, but those who knew him could see the devastation in his eyes as he realized that his life as he had known it was over. 6 months later, Judge Santos sentenced Richard Sterling to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was at the high end of federal guidelines, reflecting the court's determination to send a clear message about the consequences of corporate fraud and tax evasion. Additionally, Sterling was ordered to pay full restitution to the IRS, approximately $62 million, including penalties and interest, and to forfeit virtually his entire personal fortune. The forfeiture proceedings were swift and comprehensive. Sterling's Beacon Hill mansion was auctioned to a tech entrepreneur who had made his fortune through legitimate business practices and who promised to donate portions of his profits to workers' rights organizations. Sterling's art collection, luxury vehicles, and yacht were all sold at public auction, with the proceeds going to satisfy his restitution obligations. Sterling Industries itself was dissolved as a corporate entity. Its legitimate business operations sold to competitors who agreed to honor existing worker contracts and implement stronger labor protections. The company's name was permanently retired, ensuring that Sterling's legacy would not continue to benefit from the criminal enterprise he had built. For Sarah and Michael, Sterling's downfall marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives that exceeded their wildest dreams. With Sterling's conviction secured and his own reputation as a brilliant young attorney established, Michael was promoted to senior associate at Harrison, Blackwood and Associates, and began specializing in corporate fraud cases that protected workers and small businesses from exploitation. Sarah, meanwhile, had used the experience of Sterling's trial to find her own voice and purpose. She enrolled in business school part-time while continuing her catering work, determined to build something positive from the darkest moment of her professional life. Her business plan was ambitious, but grounded in her values: a catering company that would specialize in events celebrating community achievements, worker rights, and social justice causes. Sterling's Catering had been the tentative name she'd considered initially, but she ultimately chose Community Table Catering, reflecting her belief that food brought people together across economic and social boundaries. Her first major contract came from an unexpected source: the Children's Hospital's annual fundraising gala, the same event where she had been humiliated 3 years earlier. This time, however, Sarah walked into the Grand Metropolitan Hotel's Crystal Ballroom as the owner and operator of the catering service, not as a server hoping to remain invisible. The event was a tremendous success, with Sarah's team providing service that was both professional and warm, treating every guest with dignity regardless of their wealth or social status. Michael made partner at Harrison, Blackwood and Associates 2 years after Sterling's conviction, becoming the youngest partner in the firm's history. His reputation for meticulous preparation, ethical practice, and commitment to justice had made him one of the city's most sought-after corporate attorneys. He specialized in cases that held powerful individuals and corporations accountable for fraud, corruption, and worker exploitation. Together, Sarah and Michael purchased a beautiful Victorian house in a diverse neighborhood where teachers, police officers, small business owners, and young professionals were raising their families. The house had a large kitchen where Sarah could test new recipes, and a home office where Michael could work on cases that mattered to him personally. 5 years after Richard Sterling's arrest, Sarah received an unexpected letter forwarded through her attorney. The letter was from Sterling himself, written from his federal prison cell in Pennsylvania. In it, he apologized for his treatment of her at the charity gala and acknowledged that his behavior had been cruel and unwarranted. The apology was clearly self-serving. Sterling was hoping for early release and needed to demonstrate remorse for his actions. But Sarah chose to view it as a kind of closure, evidence that even someone as arrogant and entitled as Sterling could eventually be forced to confront the reality of his actions. He still doesn't really understand, Sarah told Michael as they sat together in their kitchen, the letter spread on the table between them. He thinks this was about revenge, about getting back at him for hurting my feelings. He doesn't realize that this was about justice, about stopping someone who was hurting people and getting away with it because he had money. Michael nodded, reaching across to take his wife's hand. That's what makes what we accomplished so important. It wasn't about personal revenge, it was about holding someone accountable who thought he was above the law. 7 years after that terrible night at the charity gala, Sarah Martinez Sterling, she had kept her maiden name professionally, but added Sterling ironically, as a reminder of how far she had come, stood before a room full of small business owners, teaching a workshop on entrepreneurship and worker rights. Her catering company now employed 15 people, all of whom received living wages, comprehensive health benefits, and profit-sharing arrangements that Sarah believed honored the dignity of their work. Michael, meanwhile, had just finished arguing a case before the state Supreme Court, representing a group of construction workers who had been cheated out of overtime pay by a corporation that had tried to classify them as independent contractors. The case would result in millions of dollars being returned to workers and new regulations that would protect thousands more from similar exploitation. Sometimes, late at night, Sarah would think about that terrible evening when Richard Sterling had tried to make her feel worthless in front of hundreds of people. She realized now that his cruelty had revealed everything about his character and nothing about hers. True worth, she had learned, was not measured by bank accounts or designer clothes, but by how you treated others, especially those who seemed powerless to defend themselves. Richard Sterling had lost his fortune, his freedom, and his reputation because he had forgotten that fundamental truth. Sarah and Michael had built successful careers, a loving marriage, and a meaningful life because they had never forgotten it. In the end, character had proven more valuable than cash, and justice had prevailed over wealth and privilege. The waitress who had been humiliated at a charity gala had become a successful entrepreneur and advocate for workers' rights. The law student who had witnessed his wife's tears had become one of the city's most respected attorneys. And the millionaire who had thought his money made him untouchable was spending his days in a federal prison cell, with plenty of time to reflect on the choices that had led him there. Some might call it poetic justice. Sarah preferred to think of it as proof that in America, when the legal system works as it should, everyone is equal under the law regardless of how much money they have or how important they think they are. The arc of justice, as Dr. King had said, was long, but it did bend toward justice, especially when good people were willing to do the patient, careful work required to bend it.